Okay, so before we get started today, I wanted to point out something about this book that I kind of just discovered this morning as I was reading through. I was looking in the back for some cheat notes. Didn't find any cheat notes for the chapter, but I found Appendix A, B, C, and D, and if you haven't looked at it, it's really powerful. It's like a handbook for how to deal with forgiveness biblically and situationally. Really good stuff. I've never seen anything quite like that put together. That definitely makes it worth the $18 that you had to buy this book for. So, chapter 6. Not an easy chapter, dealing with justice, love, forgiveness, and abuse. John and I were speaking earlier, and there's probably someone in this room who maybe was abused by another person and had to walk through some of the things we're talking about. And that's it's not an easy walk. It's not an easy road, and that's what some of this chapter talks about, is the difficulty of the Christian concept, the Christian idea, the Christian truth of forgiveness in the face of the victim, and how the victim processes that, and the different objections, if you will, from the world on the Christian truth about forgiveness, and then the struggles and the different stages that people go through that are in the process of forgiveness for being abused. And it starts out talking about that the Bible really flips the script on this honor-shame culture. So let's talk about that for a minute. We addressed it earlier in some earlier chapters, but this is a little different take on it. This honor and shame that in cultures of antiquity, this whole thing about forgiveness was not really happening. It wasn't. It was a vengeance culture and a justice culture without any concept of really forgiveness. Who can tell me about the Stoic answer to forgiveness? That's on page 88.
Well, you just sort of punish the other person by acting like they can't affect you. You don't have any power over me. You can't get to my emotions. So I'm just going to ignore what you did. But it's not forgiveness. It's punitive.
Yeah. Detach the heart from it. It's a cold kind of suppression, if you will, of actually what happened, and substituting it with, this lack of forgiveness. Don't let anything bother you. Don't let anything bounce off of you. And how does the proverb of Proverbs 23 and 20:29 sort of flip the script on that? On this whole concept of honor and vengeance.
The Proverbs calls those who do not forgive a fool, and that the Stoics were a fool, because pride brings a person low, but the lowly in spirit gain.
Yes. So.
It's not true forgiveness if you just basically say you're dead to me, you're not my friend anymore. That's not true forgiveness.
I was trying to kind of think about this. Take the low road or the high road, and we think of taking the high road as the way, but this is really speaking of taking the low road, and it's in the same sort of sense as we talk about taking the low road is realizing that just
something that was really enlightening to me was, I don't
fits in here is that where they explain an eye for an eye. And I thought that was really, I never thought of it like that. This is not revenge that you lost an eye and you take out somebody else's eye. It was a justice system for not punishing somebody for more than what they did. It wasn't a personal thing, it was to do with the justice system.
Yeah, so,
That's the next chapter.
It
Yeah.
is. But I think.
all right, you can't jump a chapter on us now.
It's hard to
No,
tell which chapter.
But you know, Carter went to the stoic part of it, they despise the other, they ignore them. Like, you know, you don't
Yeah.
do anything, but they despise them. And we know that hate doesn't hurt the object of hate, it only hurts you that has the hate in your heart. So, I mean, the stoic way is harmful.
yeah. And is this something that only happened in days gone by, or is it still going on? It's, you know,
I'm determined that philosophically, I have no problem with forgiveness, but when you get down to specifics.
Yeah, there you go.
yeah,
Believing in it and doing it's two different things.
Absolutely.
No, I think though, to me, the point I got from it was this idea of honor was you're doing that in front of other people. Like you have to, if somebody does something to you, you have to do something back to them because that's how everybody knows you're not going to let yourself be stepped on. And it's completely selfish. And so the selfless road, that low road, as you put it, is like, I'm going to walk away from that. I'm going to forgive that person. I'm going to whatever. And that's truly the honorable thing to do. It's just that it doesn't look like that to the people around you, but that's not who you should be trying to please.
yeah. And also, we're going to get in, sorry, Wayne.
I found this little chapter of business, you're taking the time and disputes of what the society going through at that time. And now we're contrasting to what we see the society going through now. And making it sound very different.
Well, I think it kind of shakes out when you talk about the substitutionary atonement, because that's eventually where it goes with the Christian theology of, you know, correct Christian theology, I should say, that walks us through the atonement and what it actually means, and that God himself took our place as well as the place of the offender who repents and turns on the cross. So we're going to get there, but John?
Yeah, I also think that it's what Keller's trying to do is lay the groundwork to contrast other pagan cultures with
Yeah.
just how completely different Jews were
Yeah.
than Christians later on, and how that's just basically a sea change in culture and in the world, and how it's, you know, the end game is substitutionary atonement, I would say.
Mhm.
We talk about Leviticus here on page 89. It's basically, don't bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I think that's
Let's talk a little bit.
completely different than the other religion.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that, because it does outline, there's some negatives there and some positive. The negatives, not seeking revenge. Well, why don't we read that text? It's right there on page 89. Does someone want to read Leviticus 19:17 through 18?
You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord.
So we've got the negative contrasted with the positive in those instances. So not to seek revenge, but what? Reason frankly. And it goes into that a little bit more, and it says that, you know, as we, you know, get into the chapter a little bit further about.
You're supposed to point out where you've been wrong reasonably, and so that you can come to an agreement, but if you're not looking for retribution, pointing out. So that
And not doing so, and not doing so is wrong, because it says you incur sin because of him. So it's actually sinful to sweep it under the rug and let it go, because then you allow it to perpetually keep going,
Well, you're-
you know, with no checks, no balances.
that's what happened when you get to the NASA thing. It was swept
Yeah.
under the rug for years and years and years.
Yeah, and we'll bring that up in a second.
We know,
Just hang on.
There's something interesting here, that if you're sort of sitting on the fence about whether or not you've really been wrong, you can ask, is this going to cause you to bear a grudge if I don't talk to the person about this? Okay, go ahead and do it. Maybe you haven't been wrong, but if it's going to kind of simmer and you're masking your heart, go ahead and talk.
You know, that's good. And one thing I'd like to bring up that's not necessarily mentioned in this book, but I think an easy way out for people that have wronged you is to tell you're too sensitive. Just, you are so sensitive. And that's how they get license in their mind to get away with it, because,
You're just supposed to toughen up.
Yeah, toughen up. And that is so common.
I actually had
So
a kid tell
common.
me one time when I was doing a unit on bullying that it was okay to bully people because you were helping them out, because you were making them
Yeah,
tough.
you're making them tough.
But I just was thinking, so much of that Old Testament law, Leviticus especially, is about the protection of the community. And that's that whole thing. You go to your brother and you tell him, look, this was not okay. Not only because you don't want him to continue sinning, you love him enough to say, you're in trouble here, but you're protecting the community. And that's the Nasser thing's a perfect example. Because nobody went and sounded the alarm, he was allowed to abuse literally hundreds of little girls.
Yeah. Interesting little story on that. You know, my daughters and her friend are going to get a house and everything. And she looked up, you know, the abusers there's a way you can do that on the internet. And, you know, in our society, you know, we want to hold people accountable. So it's not a foreign concept, even out in the world, to hold people accountable for what they've done and live with the consequences of that.
One thing there that they brought up again later, but sort of pointed out here is that Leviticus was really limited because it was just limited to the Jews. So then that was expanded on in the New Testament. So it's sort of stuck like a lot of the other
Mhm.
sort of a jumping off point for the learning the New Testament.
All right, we've made it through 2 pages so far. So not to hate, not to bear a grudge, but we must do rebuke and love. Rebuke and love. Why? What is the foundation? That's the big question. It's answered in Leviticus 19 at the very end. What's the rationale for why any of this makes sense?
I am the Lord.
I am the Lord. So it's a command of the Lord. So who is in control of this whole activity? And why do we do it? Because it feels good and makes perfect sense to us?
He says so.
He says so. Now, it does make a lot of sense when you dig into the atonement and you see what's done there and see how flipping the script is, you know, an understatement for the atonement on dealing with forgiveness. All right, so let's move on down from this. We're going to go on. Let's go on over to our example of God's justice and love applied to abuse. Someone give me the rundown, kind of the story on Rachel Dunn Hollander, the gymnast who was sexually assaulted by multiple times by Larry Nasser. We all know sort of the generalities of it. Give us some.
She was 15 when it first happened. She had a back issue and evidently that started it. And it went undetected for years. And she finally came public with it, and there were over 200 other women that came forward that had similar stories. And he denied it at first, but eventually admitted it and the rest of his life.
Wow. And then,
She was kind of interesting. She won some kind of
Yeah, and that it kind of goes into that. What were some of the challenges when she got into this forgiveness process that she ran into, like some of the critique she heard from society and culture and so forth? Because that's kind of what it gets into.
Well, basically, if you expect justice, that means you're not forgiven. You know, you expect something to be done about this, so you really haven't forgiven.
Mhm.
It's kind of the tenor of what a lot of people told.
And then, and I'd never really thought about this before, but the Christian forgiveness is a sort of divine child abuse. If you look at God the Father and Jesus on the cross. And so that's an argument that came out against Christian theology. Is that really what happened on the cross? A father abusing the son? No. That's what we dig into at the end of the chapter. It's poor theology, and she does bring that out a little bit later when when it talks about she and her husband, and he's a PhD student who wrote this paper, the foundation of a Christian approach to abuse. You know, they dive into a lot of the issues that we have in the church is poor theology. Poor theology when it comes to justification, sanctification, and the substitutionary atonement of God on the cross. What about the Mars Hill? It talks about the Mars Hill Church and what happened there. And it's another critique of forgiveness as being this hierarchical thing where, you know, it gives power to the people on the top. So if you read that about Mars Hill, that's kind of what it... they say that this holding people accountable, essentially, in the church gave these leaders in the higher positions in the church this sort of authoritarian footprint on the rest of the church. And they say that's... I don't know much about why it melted down, but apparently it had something to do with authoritarianism. In this holding people accountable, it seemed to center power in the top leaders and leave the lower, I guess, the congregation.
Just one thing to be developed from that section is when the church falls in some way, people's natural go-to assumption is it has something to do with what we say we believe. Right? I think just that alone is the thing for us to learn. It doesn't in this case. Right? It wasn't the theology that caused the problem, but the culture will always assume it was a bad witness for us.
Yeah.
We're the Mars Hill Church in Keller. Is that the same?
I think maybe it was tied to the same general concept, but I don't know that they're planting Mars Hill clones, if you will, like they were back in those days. Yeah.
Not for them anymore.
I don't think that was ever, it might have been mentioned, but I don't think it was ever a serious option.
We investigated Cumberland Presbyterian and that Mars Hill was not one. We had to go to a reformed body, and I don't think Mars Hill was
So kind of after it goes through all of these different critiques of the theology of forgiveness and all, Rachel says that she struggled with this. And she even went through the concept of removing God from the picture. She wrestled with that. And then in the end, she said, this is on page 94, removing God did not fix the problem of evil. It actually made it worse. She grappled with the critiques of the Christian faith, those that we just talked about, and her circumstances seemed to make her right for leaving it. Interesting. So That's the wrestling she went through. Is it really worth it? Is the Christian way really the way to go to deal with this forgiveness and this abuse? And so she wrestled with that. And then she goes on to say, no matter where I looked, I was confronted with things I could not explain without God. And while she had huge unanswered questions, she realized she had more real answers through my faith than I had without it. That's pretty good stuff right there. I mean, that's hit home stuff. In other words, she kind of went down the road of some of these critiques and doubting her faith and doubting the power of Christian forgiveness, but came back. What time we got, Jackie?
It's like, we have like 8 minutes.
Okay. But she came back. And that speaks to, I think, our journey along the Christian walk too. You know, we walk along and then we run into something, and wow, there's all these different answers out there about how we should handle the issues that we're facing. And many of them are not biblical. And then because we're walking the road with God and He's sanctifying our hearts, we come back and we say, this is where I truly find relief and hope. Not that we know the answers to everything, but we know that God is in control. And God, we have far more answers than we have, unanswered things. So, and then she talks about how Larry Nasser had done some good things. He'd founded this Autism Foundation. Well, wow, that's great. He did some good things, but the good things that he did not cancel out what had happened to her and what she still had to struggle with. And then on 95, they get into the cross, justice, and love. And this is where it starts talking about the theological dynamics and how poor theology kind of twists and turns this road of forgiveness into something that doesn't make sense. But on the bottom of 96, it's kind of summarized there for us. Some of the errors, the error of a typical conservative error, bottom of 96, Christ reconciling an angry God to a sinful world. So it's this angry God picture, and the cross is about this angry God satisfying, his anger on the cross. That's not what it's about. That's a to the right interpretation, like God's an angry God and that's all it's about. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there's the liberal side that said God was reconciling a sinful world to a loving God. And that's it. God is love. That's all you need to know. John talked about that, I think, last week or the week before. That concept of God is love. It's true God is love. But there are other parts that have to be filled in to have a biblical concept of who God is. So because we have a limited amount of time here, I kind of want to get down to the nuts and bolts of all this. John Stott kind of leans into it a little bit on the top of 96. He says the doctrine of Christ reconciling the world to himself is where it's at. God was reconciling the world to himself, was what happened on the cross. The doctrine of the Trinity means that on the cross, as John Stott puts it, we see the self-substitution of God. God himself comes to take the punishment and pay the debt that we should have paid. There's that example of the banker on top of 97 about the substitutionary atonement. And the one that we used to use in Evangelism Explosion was the example of the judge. Here you are in a courtroom, right? And the judge is up there in his seat, and you're guilty. You are guilty, guilty, guilty. All the jury Unanimous decision. Don, you're guilty. Carter, you are guilty. It's punishment time. And then what happens? Instead of being sentenced, the judge takes off his robe and takes your seat and takes the punishment for you. So that's really the picture of the substitutionary atonement. That
I think the thing that you brought up about that was that usually it's looked at as separate beings. That God is punishing his son, whereas then they say, well, God is, he did his son, so he's punishing himself in that way.
yeah.
So gives you a little different.
You kind of get into the mystery of the Trinity there, right? And that concept is one that talk about flipping the script. That's people just go, boom, you know, and
Get summation of the Lamb of God.
yes, I thought we kind of closed talking about that because it really does summarize it well. On page 100, talks about the Exodus and the Lamb of God, and really what's brought. We all know the Exodus story, right? I mean, the Egyptians are going to be punished. Their firstborn is going to die because of, the retribution, if you will, for what the not allowing the Hebrews to get out of Egypt, right? So what happens? All sinful because what did the blood of the Lamb painted on the post of the door do? What did it say about the inhabitants of that house? Passover, but why do you pass over?
Because the sacrifice
The
agreement.
sacrifice was necessary. And then we tie all that into when John the Baptist saw Jesus approaching, what did he say? The Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. So,
Unblemished and unbroken bones and had to be perfect.
exactly. So, I think we get all that. I think that makes complete sense. But that's where he summarizes this whole thing. It's that the ability to forgive is couched in knowing your own sinfulness, knowing how much you have been forgiven, and then it opens up the avenue, the door to truly, and what the cross did for that. Well, it's the time to close up.
Yeah, we got about 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Any parting thoughts?
But just that, and John and I talked about this morning,